Good afternoon. My name is Jongryn. I'm a senior research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, as well as a professor of political economy at Yonsei University. And it's my great pleasure to moderate this very important panel and a topic that's unusual topic in a conference like this. That's the main focus of this conference is the return of history and the future of history. But I would say the history is also a very important matters actually as much in economics as in East Asian relations and international relations. The memory of the Great Depression of the 1930s have had a profound influence on the U.S.'s responses to its own financial crisis since 2008. And this memory still dominates policy debates on the persistence of inequality, the decay of liberal democracy, and the rise of economic nationalism. So this panel raises and discusses the question of history in the future of Asian capitalism. Have post-crisis reforms, like the one we saw after 1997 Asian financial crisis, return to Asia? Or will Asia avoid the repeat of Asian financial crisis? I will ask each panelist to speak for 10 minutes, or actually 5 minutes. And the main questions that this panel raises, and I summarize our questions as two, and what impact the 2008 global financial crisis have had on the development of financial markets, either in Asia or in your country, and what are the main challenges for developing strong financial markets in your country or in Asia? And is there a strong intellectual consensus on the need and the direction of financial market reform in Asia? So I hope you will answer these questions. And before I give you the floor, let me introduce our panelists. We are very privileged to have a distinguished group of experts and policymakers with us today. And our first panelist is to my left, Dr. Let me go get Dr. Kang Dongsoo. He's the director and the vice president of Department of Financial Policy at the leading Korean think tank, Korea Development Institute. And to his left is Mr. Stephen Kargman. And he's the president of the Kargman Associates. He served in a number of positions in the United States government. And for example, served as a lead attorney with the Export-Import Bank of the United States and the general counsel of the New York State Financial Control Board. And our third panelist is Dr. Khoo Teik. He's a professor at the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies in Tokyo, but originally from Malaysia. And our last panelist is a good friend from Societe Generale Corporate Investment Bank, and he's the main Korean economist for the bank based in Seoul, and he worked before the current position, worked as a chief economist at Standard Chartered and Citibank in Seoul. Yes, Dr. Kang, I think we'll begin with you and speak for 5 minutes on these important questions. Please.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Mo. It's a great honor for me to be part of the Asan Plenum. And as an economist, I think the Asian capitalism is a quite broad theme. So let me tell you about the Korean story more specifically. For the last couple of decades, Korea has experienced numerous crises. The most typical one is 2008 global financial crisis and earlier 1997 currency crisis. In general, crisis occurs due to a kind of eruption of enormous pressure from underlying imbalances. So after the crisis, usually we will find totally new different type of the economic landscape. So there is no exception in Korean cases. So, for example, after the 1997 currency crisis and 2000 global financial crisis, we have seen the large potential GDP growth rate drop, say by over 1 percentage point. So in such a case, as a large GDP drop, potential growth rate sense, the strategy to respond to such phenomena is either overcoming strategy, or the other is the adaptation to a new environment. So after 1997, we have seen the kind of overcoming strategy. So say a lot of people with large pains from the massive restructuring and reforming measures in the course of in the financial sector, corporate sector, and public sector, and even labor sector. So basic consensus was that at the time was that we need to have a more efficient system, economic system. So efficiency is the main theme, and consensus, say, after the 1997 crisis. But the public consensus to the 2008 crisis was a little bit different. I mean, a whole lot different. Say, the pursuit of the economic efficiency is not a social consensus any longer. So rather, more people are interested in fairer distribution rather than economic efficiency. Why this kind of phenomena take place? Say, back in early 2000, we have seen the economic recovery and restore the resiliency, but the other side effect was, say, worsening income gap, or the economic polarization at the time. So obviously, in a very competitive environment, and we know we have some information to discriminate the productivity the people, then obviously we do not have to offer the same wages of the laborers of different productivity. So that is the main reason of the polarization. But after we are getting more efficient economy, then we have seen some, the large income gap. But when we see what we see in the global financial crisis was those people who are pursuing the economic efficiency are some of the land seekers at the cost of innocent followers. That means we have seen large group of the people who have make a fortune at the cost of the innocent people. Say this is the kind of saying that we have to prove, but this is a public sentiment. So under such circumstances, people ask for the fair distribution instead of the economic efficiency. That is the kind of big challenge. A couple of months ago, KDI conducted a survey over 500 ordinary people. The question was, say, what is the biggest obstacle to economic recovery now? This is the subjective question with no guiding choices. Out of 500 ordinary people, about 12.4% point out politics, and 11.4% corruption, and 5.4% large enterprises. Another 5.4% point out selfishness, and 4.3% government, and so on and so forth. What do you infer from this kind of answers? I think we can see that the public sentiment of demanding fairer distribution instead of the economic efficiency. So under such kind of circumstances, it is not easy to propose the optimization of financial regulation. I mean, after the global financial crisis, we have seen a very, in some sense, excessive degree of financial regulation. But that is based on the public sentiment in some sense. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges that Korean economy faces, and also the Asian capitalism faces. So, but it's a much strengthened and still strengthening financial regulations is good for economy. That is the quite, fundamental question at this juncture. I think the well-structured and balanced deregulation scheme targeting for both efficiency and fairness should be devised so as to achieve the social sustainability and public needs altogether. Okay.
Thank you very
Let me
much.
stop here.
Yes, Dr. Kang, then maybe we'll turn to Mr. Kargman and share your views on China and Asia as a whole. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mo. As everyone knows, many of the major emerging economies in Asia over the last 10 to 15 years have experienced significant and very dynamic growth, in fact. The Asian financial crisis of the late 1990s seems like a distant memory. But in the coming period, the question will be whether these major Asian emerging economies can deal with the sluggishness in the global economy and slow down in some of their own economies. And this will test the resiliency of these major emerging economies in Asia, because it will be a different economic and financial scenario and environment for them to operate in. It will no longer be just a growth scenario, it'll be a more challenging environment of slower growth. And as counterintuitive as it may seem, the resiliency of these economies will turn in large part on whether these economies have put in place the systems and practices that allow economies generally to surmount financial and economic challenges in an effective and timely way. This raises a number of questions about the capability and willingness of these economies to act in a decisive and commercially oriented manner, reflecting internationally recognized best practices. For example, will the Asian emerging economies be prepared to deal with what is certain to be a rising tide of corporate defaults and a growing stock of non-performing loans in their banking systems? China just had its first bond default in the last month or two, and more defaults are expected. Will the Asian economies be prepared to face head-on the challenges of financially troubled state-owned enterprises, SOEs? Or will they try to paper over the difficulties of these SOEs when these SOEs experience financial distress? This is an issue in China, but in other economies in Asia as well. For example, in Vietnam, their major shipbuilding company, Venashin, went through a restructuring in the last few years, and the fact that they finally reached a restructuring agreement after very long negotiations was hailed as some type of triumph. But the fact of the matter was they were only dealing with a fraction of the debt of the whole Venetian corporate empire. So the SOEs will need to be addressed in China, but in other economies as well. Will the Asian economies address these myriad challenges in a commercial, market-oriented way, or will they, as too often was the case in the late 1990s, revert to protecting vested interests at the expense of investors and creditors, especially where those investors and creditors are foreign? Following the Asian financial crisis, there were many corporate defaults in the affected countries, and then there were restructuring exercises that took place, but many of the creditors found those exercises to be unsatisfactory because the debtor companies and their controlling shareholders weren't willing to engage in a forthright and commercially oriented way. So the end result was a series of agreements, restructuring agreements, that were not seen as meeting international standards. And the question is whether that pattern will repeat itself again in the coming period here. The major emerging economies in Asia have truly gone global in recent years, particularly as they have tapped the global capital markets in a very significant way. But if and when these economies face serious financial and economic challenges, will these economies and their companies abide by global standards and practices, or will they fall back on local practices and standards designed to protect local interest? It's easy for them to go into the global markets these days, but when they face difficulty, sometimes companies in this region, particularly after the Asian financial crisis, acted in anything but a global manner. They basically retreated behind their national boundaries to keep their creditors and investors at bay. So we'll have to see whether that pattern again repeats itself. Many of the major Asian emerging economies have enacted far-ranging reforms to their commercial law regimes in the post-Asian financial crisis world. And these reforms were enacted so that they would conform more closely to international standards. Reforms such as new, more reorganization as opposed to liquidation-oriented insolvency laws. But will these Asian economies ensure that these laws are implemented and enforced in a straightforward and transparent manner? And will the local courts in these jurisdictions be a help or a hindrance in this process? A number of the countries throughout this region did, in fact, enact far-reaching commercial law reforms in the last 10 to 15 years. But the question is, will the laws be enforced as they are written in the statutes, or will there be some other way that the courts look at these statutes and really don't pay strict attention to what the statute says? And the courts, of course, have always been an issue in the emerging markets, and the independence of the courts and the technical competence of certain courts, and will these courts be well positioned and capable of dealing with more corporate defaults and dealing with them in a professional and independent manner? The challenges likely to face Asian emerging economies and companies in the coming years will likely put the spotlight on corporate governance issues and practices. But will corporate governance concerns be given short shrift, as unfortunately has too often been the case in the past? Or will putting in place world-class corporate governance standards, including among other things the establishment of robust auditing systems, be considered a top priority for corporations so that these corporations can truly serve the best interests of all of their stakeholders? One thing that stakeholders discovered in the wake of the Asian financial crisis when they were dealing with financially distressed companies was that the corporate governance standards at many of these companies were very low, and that made it very difficult to put the companies back on a sound footing. And then when corporate governance reforms were proposed to these companies, in many cases they were actively resisted. In short, the coming period could determine whether the major Asian economies, particularly the emerging economies, will be able to go from strength to strength based on a solid foundation of strong systems and internationally recognized best practices designed to help corporations and economies address and surmount financial and economic challenges, or whether these economies will founder when they encounter the inevitable financial and economic challenges that are posed by slower economic growth.
Thank you very much. Dr. Khoo?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Professor Mo. First of all, it's an honor for me to be here, and for that I wish to thank the Asan Institute. Second, it's already late in the plenum, but I should still add a note of condolence to the people of Korea. As a Malaysian who had watched very recently with dismay the mysterious disappearance of MH370, I cannot but help feel doubly sad that I should be in Korea at this very difficult moment for your society. Mr. Kargman has raised several questions about what might or might not happen in the way of reforming Asian economies for the future, especially in anticipation of potential problems. I'm not an economist, and I shall largely talk about political issues related mostly also to Southeast Asia, and particularly three countries, Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia, which were probably the most badly affected countries at the time of the 1997-98 crisis, financial crisis. But let me start by making a few prefatory remarks on models and history, which seem to be one of the underlying themes of this plenum. I think we ought to be careful when we lump a lot of economies together under Asian economies or East Asian economies or emerging economies or high-performing Asian economies and so on. Why do I say so? There was a time around 1993 when the World Bank issued its East Asian Miracle publication that we found that so many of the Asian economies, including the Southeast Asian ones, being lauded as high-performing Asian economies. Only 4 years later, they would become, basically members of submerging economies, and for which, all the applause of the past few years had turned to actually a lot of mocking disapproval at the way these Asian economies and regimes manage their own affairs. And to go one step further, if you took most of these economies as being part of an East Asian category that was in very serious trouble, then you could also end up with an IMF sort of antidote, what people have called a one-size-fits-all, that didn't pay attention to essentially maybe very important differences between these different economies. The other thing about thinking about models and history is I think we ought to be careful. Very often it is easy to say we ought to learn from history, but what should we learn from history? And what do we learn from history that we can apply in the right time under conditions that make sense for us to apply those kinds of lessons? I mean, you could very well learn what seem like appropriate lessons only to apply them at the wrong time. Okay, I say this because if we look at the East Asian crisis of 1997-98, ideologically, a lot of the narrative of the crisis pinpointed such things as Asian values as being the source of a lot of our problems. Of course, before the crisis, there were statesmen and the politicians in Asia who talked about Asian values as being the source of precisely the strength of the Asian economies. Right? But if you look at the 2008 crisis, which was largely and originally a Western crisis that became very quickly labeled as a global crisis, no doubt its impacts went beyond the Western economies. But the fact is that when the Asian economies face a lot of stress, they were told, or the societies were told, that at heart, the prescriptions for turning things around were going to be transparency, better governance, stricter accountability, best international practices, and so on. An end to crony capitalism, an end to essentially state regulation of the economies, state intervention, and largely, I don't think it is exaggerating to say that what they ought to do was to transform their economies towards the model of a self-regulating market system. And in that conjuncture too, at that conjuncture, it was also conflated. A couple of things were conflated. One was that a market system would go together with democracy. And in the wake of the Southeast Asian crisis for countries like Indonesia, Thailand, and Malaysia particularly, things turned out to be quite different. If I were to now, in a way, address some of the questions posed by Mr. Kargman, but to do so in a political manner rather than to go into many of the technical, more economistic or corporate concerns, I would say that we have the following things that we need to think about. When we say that economies ought to reform, to be reformed, we've got to ask in whose interests those reforms should be taken and would be taken, and who might actually oppose those reforms. In the aftermath of the 1997-98 crisis, we found that in these Southeast Asian countries that I've mentioned, perhaps the people or the interests and the quarters most opposed to many kinds of pro-market reforms were precisely the oligarchic sections of the society. We shouldn't talk about generally East Asian indifference to market reforms or Southeast Asian reluctance to adopt Western values. These things don't help us really lay our fingers on many things that either happened or didn't happen. And if you go back then to these countries and see what happened then, you will find that a lot of the political turmoil that erupted during that period, in fact, remains with us today. In fact, that is even more important because if you look at the 2008 crisis, although Southeast Asian economies were not unaffected, they had slower export growth, they had slower growth as a knock-on effect of the crisis. Nonetheless, the political turmoil that happened in 1997-98 was not matched by any kind of comparable turbulence or tumult in Southeast Asia. Today, as a result of that kind of turmoil in the Southeast Asia and a kind of oligarchic resistance to many kinds of reforms, we find that in Indonesia, we now have politically probably the freest, procedurally the most democratic country in the region, but one in which high-level corruption is so persistent and so pervasive that it is not simply questions of good governance, but how to curb the predatory tendencies and habits of this oligarchy that really lie at the heart of our problem. In Thailand, we have a situation where Thaksin Shinawatra, tried to deal with the problems of Thai society, partly by resisting some IMF conditionalities to help some big businesses in Thailand then, but also making use of a lot of unhappiness at the popular level to reinvent, to restructure Thai politics. But the result is that we have today turmoil in Thailand that continues, and this comes from the Korea Herald of today. And you've got a situation where, on the one hand, Thaksin was protecting essentially oligarchic interests, including his own, but being able to mobilize on a populist platform resistance against that kind of oligarchic aggrandizement. But the result today is that the old established oligarchy has gone for Thaksin in a manner that has been completely unprecedented in Thai politics. I mean, coup after coup, military, constitutional, and so on, has been conducted essentially to try and overturn not just Thaksin himself. He's now, I think, an icon and to some extent justification, but the kind of populist resistance against what is going on. Now, in my own country, Malaysia, perhaps in a way it was saved from having to undertake very serious so-called pro-market reforms because of Mahathir Mohamad's rather obdurate and in some ways people would say rather courageous stand against the financial markets of the day. And as a result, with his use of capital controls, of a return to a currency peg and other kinds of measures, he managed to save some of the most strategic economic sectors, some of the largest corporations, some of the most influential business interests, and generally, I think, also to prevent the collapse of the economy. Now, if we take all this together, where does it really lead us? As I said at the beginning, people talk sometimes, I think, glibly about learning from history. If some of the lessons of the East Asian financial crisis of '97 were so obvious and so necessary to be implemented, how was it that the Western economies, the Western financial systems did not learn from there to be much better in terms of accountability, in terms of transparency in their financial dealings, in terms of good governance, in terms of many other things? I mean, what we have seen in Southeast Asia, we later saw, although it was not for very long, the Occupy Wall Street movement and the proliferation of a lot of Occupy movements. Essentially, I think, not very different as populist objections to oligarchic dominations of the societies. And this is where I think some of the lessons may be important. Now, to conclude, again, maybe on a note of irony or so, when the Southeast Asian economies were in trouble, lots of people in the academia, in the regional and international media, and so on, urged upon them, to learn, certain kinds of lessons, to learn all these different lessons from history. But as we can see in the aftermath, there is really no Western model that can be particularly attractive now. If the earlier model was a problem and led to 1997, the prescribed model led to 2007 and 2008. Now, look, I'm not into, Schadenfreude. That is to say, I don't take pleasure from the pain of other people. But if there's one lesson, ironically, that some people should learn, it might be to invert everything now and for the economies in Europe and the societies to ask, would, in the aftermath of the 2007-2008 crisis, would the political turmoil that we have seen in some of the smaller, more vulnerable European states, such as the PIGS countries and especially Greece, actually last way beyond the short-term effects of the 2008 crisis? Thank you.
Mr. Oh?
Yeah. So I've heard lots of the wide range of the themes, and since I have worked as an economist in the last 18 years, my discussion should be focused on what happens in the financial markets, the Asian financial market after the 2008 crisis. What I saw is, yes, as you heard, the 2008 crisis was basically, led by the problems in the developed country, it's dubbed as a subprime crisis. So, and in some senses, what I felt was that financial market, the global financial market crisis was actually kind of opportunity for lots of Asian countries, especially China and other emerging Asian, so-called emerging Asian countries, or the Southeast Asian countries. And in some senses, what I felt when I remembered, in 2009, right after the crisis, is that people in the world actually demand for some big push or big stimulus from China, and China answered that the demand. So at least in the last the 4 or 5 years, basically the Asia was very active, and in some senses China or over emerging Asia seems to have become a kind of savior in the global economy. So yes, maybe in terms of overall impact of that 2008 crisis onto Asian economy, especially emerging Asia, I think that until now, it has been pretty positive, and in some senses it was driving a kind of another boom in this emerging Asia. So, and unfortunately, that was followed by some sort of slowdown or crisis or whatever that you already heard. Basically, these days, almost everybody's worrying about the slowdown in Chinese economy, and I think that that's in some senses a part of the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, because as I mentioned, right after the crisis, people they actually asked China to become a great help onto the global economy. So China answered that the demand, and they created their own big bubble or whatever, and basically the China have to deal with all the the byproduct and the problems that came from that kind of big bubble. So I think so the experience in the emerging Asia in general is quite unique, and I think it's pretty different from the so-called Asian crisis days in 1997 and 8. Back then, the Asia was the origin of the crisis, and we had all the problems and all the the difficulties. Meanwhile, in the recent cases, in some senses, the emerging Asia was kind of beneficiary of this the global financial crisis, but nowadays we are having a problem. And in some senses, that kind of argument, that the emerging Asia was kind of beneficiary of the global financial crisis may not apply to Korea, because in some senses, what I feel is that China and lots of Southeast Asian countries had its own boom bust cycle in the last 5 years, but in Korea, of course, the South Korean economy recovered very quickly from that, the global financial crisis in 2009, perhaps. But after that, while we watched a considerable boom in lots of other Asian countries, in Korea, the economy and the financial market was pretty stable. So maybe a good example is that in the last almost 3 years, the KOSPI, the Korea's main equity market index, has been just sticked at the level between 1800 and 2000. So some people say that it's box B, box plus KOSPI. So in some senses, the lots of Korean people feel that maybe we are a bit somehow isolated from the boom in lots of the other Asian countries, nowadays even Japan. So what I want to highlight is that maybe Korea has been very unique since the global financial crisis, because in some senses, the Korean policymakers are very cautious and introduced lots of the new regulations, Of course, I know that the lots of developed countries also introduced lots of regulations, but in some senses, I think the Korea was the leader in introducing that kind of so-called macro-prudential measures. And I remember that our officials actually were pretty, proud of introducing that kind of, very innovative measures on the financial market or the housing market, and the G20 or lots of other, the global meetings. So, at least in Korea, maybe the problem is that the market was too tightly regulated, or maybe the government and even the general public in Korea has been maybe too cautious. Of course, that's the reason why last year when other emerging market was pretty, have difficulties, Korea was seen as quite safe place. So, of course, that could be a good thing. But what I think is that maybe in the last 4 or 5 years, the Korean people and Korean authorities were too cautious, and maybe I think at least what the Korean people need and Korean economy need is maybe more kind of risk-taking culture, or maybe a bit looser regulations. Of course, I know that in the developed countries, they argue that the kind of they're too unregulated, and maybe the capital market and financial market should be more regulated. Maybe the unregulated and deregulation was maybe one of the cause of the global financial crisis. I know that kind of argument, but in some senses, in the Asian culture, I think maybe we should be kind of in the middle. So I think in Korea, the atmosphere and the market, the officials, and maybe even the intellectual circle is that I think the people prefer too much of the regulations, and in some senses, of course, I'm working at the financial sector, but these days, I feel that some people actually think the financial market is just a kind of the supporting measure or supporting mechanism of the other more important sectors of the economy. While maybe 10 years ago we heard that the financial market is very important for the success of the Korean economy. We heard the argument that the developed Korea is a financial hub, and the global the financial hub or regional financial hub. But these days that kind of the discussion totally disappeared. So what I think is that situation differs among the countries, and at least in Korea, after the global financial crisis, the atmosphere onto the financial market gets maybe too strict, and people view the financial market basically the place to regulate. But what I want to stress is that maybe to a better and maybe faster growth of the Korean economy, of course, there should be a lot to be done. But I think these days, the people, we heard lots of discussion about this deregulation in Korea, and I think that the financial market is one of the critical sectors that we should deregulate. But my own feeling is that we heard about the deregulation in lots of other areas, but the deregulation on the financial market was kind of less discussed. And of course, I think that seems to be the legacy of the global financial crisis. Everybody believed that to avoid and to prevent another crisis, we should tighten the regulation onto the financial markets. But I think in some senses, basically, we should be careful not to overkill the dynamics in the financial market, and I think that maybe deregulation is also important on the financial market.
Okay, Dr. Let me follow up with one point. I think that Dr. Kang mentioned this dichotomy between efficiency and fairness. And my understanding of strong financial markets is that strong financial markets are both efficient and fair. So we can use actually strong financial market to address some of the problems that Dr. Khoo mentions, like the power of the oligarch and big businesses, and you need very strong financial market to balance them and then bring about a more transparency and accountability in corporate governance. So with that in mind, let me ask that everyone seems to be saying here that market reforms are everywhere in retreat, and countries are very carefully trying to design regulations to prevent another crisis. But there must be some exceptions, for example, because a country like Korea already thought that could have used this opportunity to develop a very strong financial market. Instead, if anybody, it's the United States and Europe who has to strengthen regulations, but other countries who are not, really did not cause the crisis, could have taken this opportunity to promote their own financial industries. So my question to the panelists, whether you know of any country in Asia whose financial market actually became stronger and more efficient after 2008, and bucking the general trend toward more regulation and a smaller financial market. Can you think of any country or sector that can be example, a successful example? Dr. Kang, would you like to?
Well, back in 2008, we have seen kind of déjà vu of 1997 crisis in the banking sector. A lot of banks is technically in default. I mean, means in terms of the prudential regulations. I mean, large commercial banks meet the BIS capital BIS ratio under 8%, but it was not officially, revealed. But around October and November, that is time of when the Financial Supervisory Authority does not reveal the official statistics. But that was a kind of problem. A lot of the is that speculative investors attacked Korean financial market. So in just a couple of months before there was a swap agreement with the Federal Reserve Board, Korean, the reserve currency, foreign currency reserves nosedive by $50 billion in just 2 months. So it's a kind of another liquidity crisis at the moment. But the difference is back in 1997 that the origination of the problem came from Korea, but in 2008 the origination came from the advanced countries. So the advanced country gave the hands in the form of the currency swap. So we can successfully overcame the liquidity crunch in year 2008. So after the 2008 crisis, many commercial banks learned their lessons. We need more liquidity, and we have better, the capital adequacy. So at the moment, these days, large commercial banks have shown about 16% of the BIS capital adequacy ratio. Some banks, least prudent ones, showed about 12% or so. So it is a kind of the big advancement. the main reason is the tougher, a stronger financial regulation is imposed, and another thing is voluntary participation. Voluntary participation in the broadening the capital base by the commercial banks. In the year 2011, we have experienced the European fiscal debt crisis. But if you look at the currency market in the year 2011, throughout the year, we have seen very stable currency market. The Korean currency to US dollar exchange rate have stood within just a couple of % band throughout the year, even if the big problem occurred in the European territory. So what is the difference? We have better, financial system. It means the commercial banks' financial position becomes sounder. Their long-term borrowing is share of the long-term borrowing is much higher than back in 2008, and also macroprudential is one of the key factors to reduce down the over leverage at the time. Obviously, the investment banks is complaining about the harsh regulation of the macroprudential. For instance, the forward swap rate position. But most importantly, Korean economy has the capacity of generating the cash. That means the large current account surpluses. So this given the capacity to generate the cash, our macroeconomy becomes quite sound. So I think for the last 5 years, after the global financial crisis, we have seen better system. More stable system. But on the other hand, our economic growth potential in the real economy side, not the financial market, less vigorous. So that means we have very little investment. We have very few investment opportunities to make enormous profit. So currently the main challenges in real economy is how to boost up the investment. But another interpretation of the lower level of facility investment is, the economy is not heated up. So there is a low likelihood of the going into the bubbles, in some sense. So the financial regulation the focus of financial regulation converts from macroprudential to conduct of business regulation these days. So consumer protection is much more important than in the prudential regulations. So that is the kind of social mood. So before that, I told you that the main point is not that much of the efficiency. Is that currently a lot of people ask for the fairer distribution and transparency and accountability. So how to reduce down the information gap. So that is the kind of challenges that financial system designers face at this moment. So give more information and better information to the market. And under this better information environment, the financial market participants trade each other. That is the kind of the things we have to achieve in the next couple of years.
Okay. We don't have that much time left, so why don't we answer questions very briefly, like 1 or 10 minutes. Can you think of another success story? We are very proud of our achievement, but Korean financial markets are not very popular in Korea. I'll go back to you after this round, then I'll go to the audience. So, any other country or sector that's
Well, I think Mr. O touched on this, that China responded effectively to the global financial crisis by pumping a lot of money into the economy. So at the time, that seemed like a very effective measure. But presently, they're facing the fallout from that because a lot of the loans that were made were not good loans, and they made lots of loans to these so-called local government investment vehicles that were supposed to build infrastructure at the local level, but they built projects that weren't really needed. So while they had an effective response to the global financial crisis, they've now created the conditions for a major challenge in the coming years in terms of a new wave of non-performing loans.
But I was going to wait until we done with the first round. But would you? We have a lot of students here who are not really experts on financial market. What's the probability of another crisis originating in China with this bad loans and yes?
Well, everybody has their own view on what's going to happen in China in terms of the bad loan situation and the property market, overheated property market, especially in the big cities. And some of this has been talked about for a few years that it's imminent. So I think it's hard to say, frankly. I think the important thing for the Chinese is that they really need to do the contingency planning for the day when these problems do come to a head. And as I was alluding to in my remarks, I think they need to put in place better systems and practices to deal with these types of financial challenges.
Okay. Do you see any bright spot in Asia in terms of the financial markets, Dr. Khoo?
Yeah, well, in Southeast Asia, I mean, almost by default, one can probably think of Singapore as being, a place where the financial markets have been fairly well regulated, and therefore they've been, in many ways, able to escape the worst of the 1997 crisis. To my knowledge, in 2008, 2009, some of their companies and banks and even the GLCs took a hit, partly because, I guess they are a financial hub and are tied to the global financial system much more critically than others. But at least you could say of this place that by sheer, this is not the most liberal sort of political system, but perhaps precisely because of that, they have not tolerated, I think, a lot of the kinds of chicanery that you saw in the other Southeast Asian systems, right? And for that matter, in the Western economies.
Mr. O, can I ask a different question? Any Chinese city that has a chance to become a financial center? Do you think of any? Because people have been talking about Shanghai or Beijing, but I don't know with respect to Hong Kong, I don't know when any of those cities making good progress to become the match or rival of Hong Kong.
But as I worked at basically the global bank, I still have to say that the capability of Hong Kong and Singapore is much greater than Shanghai or Beijing, and still in some senses maybe the Chinese mainland could not be the financial hub, because I think it's actually very practical matters. The Hong Kong and Singapore is still they had the legacy of the British colony, and practically in this industry, language is very important, and that kind of English using the society, I think, is very, a kind of, the privileged conditions. So I think that the status of Hong Kong and Singapore in this Asian financial hub, I think that it could last at least one more generation. That's my.
Okay. Now we'll go to our audience who's been very patient. When you ask a question, please introduce yourself and tell us whom you are directing your question to. Yes, the gentleman there.
My name is Don Kirk. I'm a journalist. I write quite a lot about economic issues. The leaders of the three biggest groups here all have very severe criminal records against their own organizations, as do the leaders and some of the top executives of many other groups. I wonder to what you attribute this amazing phenomenon here in Korea and what impact this has on the economy here and on the economy of the region. Thank you.
Anybody would like to answer? Mr. Commentator? That sounds like your question, no? Korea? You mean the Korea, right?
Yeah,
The table?
in reference to Korea.
Yeah.
The leaders of the largest three all have incredible criminal records. One
Yeah.
of them is in jail right now.
That's right, that's right. Maybe Dr. Kang or Mr. Oh, what impact these investigations had on the Korean business climate?
So, as an economist, all I can say is that Korea is a very big country. Its GDP is I think even for maybe this year, $1.5 trillion. Of course, the leaders of that big business group could have kind of influence maybe and some of the business, the circular society, but what I can say is that sometimes the importance of that big corporation is exaggerated than what it is actually what it actually is. So my thinking is that since Korea is very big and I think the economy is sufficiently autonomous and it's having its own way, so that kind of maybe a specific event, maybe even a political event, may not have a big impact on the GDP growth or the operation of the economy itself.
Dr. Kang, would you like to add?
Well, as long as the company's size is outside top 5, I think the Korean economy can manage the problem. But within top 5, I guess, then it may be some problem. So, I mean, last year we have seen the Dongyang group failure. So market did not react that much. I mean, just it is a no knowledge already, and also the Korean economy have the capacity to contain such kind of the failures. I mean, that size.
Okay, we'll go to our next questioner.
I'm Stephen Wong from Malaysia. There is a Chinese saying, seek truth from facts. We've been treated to many facts. I'm still not quite sure what the truth element in this is. Number one, is capitalism, Asian or otherwise, in crisis? Okay? I ask this question because we have these opposing trends that have been raised, questions about equity, questions about populist uprising against, not having a fair wage, having a fair share, having standards of living. We have got increased political, interventions now that are populist, trying to bring back, more state interventions. Is capitalism, Asian or otherwise, in crisis? That's number one. Number two, it's a bit unfortunate that this afternoon we have reduced capitalism to financial markets. Financial markets do not dictate the overall sort of idea of capitalism and what it means, private entrepreneurship, and so forth. Can I ask, is the future for Asia, we've got two current trends. One is towards more liberalization, and in some parts of Asia, less liberalization. So if we can come back to basics and tackle these two questions at the big thing, then we can see all the little exceptions in the various countries. And I think it'll be maybe a bit more productive to take away that in the next 10 years in Asia, we will see less capitalism, this, that, and the other. Thank you.
Yes, very good question. I mean, I will phrase it as the choice between, I think, American style Anglo-Saxon model is out of fashion in Asia. So our choices are basically between European welfare state or our old developmental state, the returning to developmental state. And my view is that we are leaning toward the old developmental model, good or bad. But I'm sure that my friends here have other opinions. Would anyone like to answer the questions? Yes?
Yeah. Oh, well, that's a rather tough couple of questions that Steve has posed, but let me just try briefly. In the first place, I think it depends on how you look at capitalism. If you don't split it just according to regions, etc., if you take it as a whole, it will periodically and almost all the time show crisis at some point or another in some part of the world. Is this one? Yes, I think so. I mean, it is only a question of whether you choose to call it a particular crisis, the ruble crisis, the peso crisis, the East Asian crisis, or the global crisis, depending on the scale. But very often, because of the way it develops in its own uneven, patterns, etc., some part of the world, is liable to be in crisis, so long as it's still part of the global capitalist system. So I think that if you are prepared to look at it globally, yes, it will always be crisis. But if you're asking whether it is in terminal crisis and it is about ready to be replaced, that is a wholly different question. I don't think that's likely to happen. That is to say, since we've got a theme like the future of capitalism, I think you still have to say a future of Asian capitalism, that the future is going to be capitalist and Asia is going to be part of it. You are right that we should probably not reduce capitalism to just the financial markets. It's just that the theme of this particular session has to do with two crises, both of which were crises of the financial and banking systems primarily before they affected other economic sectors very seriously. Right? And it is partly because in this particular phase of capitalism throughout the world, the financialization of the economies in almost all countries has reached such an important extent that the crisis in the financial systems become crisis of capitalism itself. But we do not reduce it to that. I think that's very important. Because even for Southeast Asia and for the other Asian economies, if you think about it, they would never have been able to develop up to this point, crisis notwithstanding, without just doing other things besides having a financial system, right? Whether it is Singapore, for that matter, whether it is Malaysia, in Thailand, and so on.
Would like to, yes, our last question goes to.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Professor Mo asked about successful stories on this financial crisis. I would like to speak about India. India was one of the few economies which kind of faced the crisis very well. The impact of the global financial crisis of 2008-9 and also the East Asian crisis of 97-98. India was one of the few emerging economies in Asia which faced the challenge very well. And one of the reasons for that was our financial markets are not as open as others, and we don't have capital account convertibility. We had only current account convertibility. Even now, capital account convertibility is not there in India, and that's one of the reasons why we have been able to safeguard, or we were kind of insulated from the crisis that took place in 97-98 as well as in the late 2000. And I was wondering whether now that Asia has been able to fairly cope well with the crisis, both the East Asian crisis as well as the global financial crisis, would the idea of an Asian monetary union still exist, or it's dead, or what's the way forward? I just would like to know from the panelists.
Anybody like to? Yes.
So my own feeling is that yes, India can maintain that kind of the relatively close capital markets, but frankly speaking, I think basically after the crisis, the development of this Asian financial market was driven by China, I think, and China is simply, I think, the too big and too advanced to maintain that kind of strict, capital control. Of course, I know that China also still, has maintained some sort of the capital control, but what I think is that at least the Chinese market is maybe a bit more open than India, as far as I believe, and I think that yes, after the global financial crisis, there are lots of discussions about the capital control, and there should be some sort of capital control when the market is, in a turmoil, or the development of status of the country is still, not, strong enough to accept it. But my own belief is that the capital control is not a good measure to encourage the growth of the global economy and the normal times. Of course, when there's some kind of really hard times or really a serious crisis, a temporary measures could be applied. But what I believe is that eventually, I think the mobility of capital as a tool for the efficiency. Dr. Kang says that basically there's a dispute between the efficiency and the more equality, but what I think is that basically, efficiency should remain at least one of the very important goals. And I think that the capital mobility should continue to be, considered as a key measure or key, instrument to secure that kind of, the efficiency in a global, manner.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think our time is up. I wanted to end this panel with a very optimistic note. After hearing panelist discussions, and I must say that the future of Asian capitalism is not very bright, and it's uncertain. And Asian economies may not be ready for future, and return of history, and there's still a possibility that another crisis may break out in Asia, and many countries are not ready or do not have right systems and practices in place to deal with them. Thank you very much, and I thank the audience for your patience and your interest. I'm sorry that I didn't give you a chance to ask questions, and I'd like to thank the panelists for your great presentation. Okay. Thank you very much.